Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really sweeping and honestly highly critical breakdown of modern U.S. foreign policy, mapped out by the renowned economist and policy analyst Jeffrey Sachs. If you follow global politics, you know things are pretty tense right now. Well, Sachs connects the dots in a very specific and some would say startling way. He basically argues that the whole architecture of America's global strategy is a giant house of cards. He says it's built on outdated ideas, funded by just an absolute mountain of endless debt, and driven by a select few rather than the actual public. So our goal today is to unpack his analysis step by step and see exactly how he views the hidden gears of this massive global machine.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To really get Sachs's mindset, you have to hear this chilling quote. Sachs actually kicks things off with this famous quip from Henry Kissinger to set the geopolitical tone. To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. It's a tragic irony, right? But Sachs believes it perfectly captures modern American diplomacy. According to him, getting tangled up in the American sphere of influence, whether you're a rival or a strategic ally, often ends in absolute disaster for those countries. He uses this quote to frame his core point, that American intervention, even when it's all wrapped up in the friendly language of alliance, is ultimately just about American dominance.
So to really grasp this house of cards theory, we're going to follow his argument through 5 key steps. First, current geopolitical crises. Second, the grand chessboard strategy. Third, the war economy. Fourth, cracks in American primacy. And finally, a looming financial crisis.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Current Geopolitical Crises. Sachs starts by looking at the immediate state of the world, which, let's be honest, he views as deeply and dangerously unstable right now. He argues that the major conflicts dominating our news feeds, they aren't just isolated spontaneous events. Whether we're talking about the devastating Israel and Gaza conflict and the resulting international isolation, or the grinding war in Ukraine, or even the constant escalations with Iran, Sachs's view is that U.S. involvement isn't bringing peace to these areas. Actually, he says it's actively fueling the danger. In places like Gaza, for instance, he argues that allied governments are operating with what he calls complete impunity, entirely backed by U.S. military and diplomatic cover. So in his eyes, the U.S. isn't putting out geopolitical fires, it's practically supplying the oxygen.
But here is a really critical piece of Sachs's puzzle, the public disconnect. He makes this emphatic point that there is a massive, gaping divide between what the military-industrial complex wants and what everyday citizens actually want. I mean, whether you look at the American public or European citizens who are increasingly anti-war, people are just completely disgusted with these endless conflicts. And yet, the intelligence agencies, presidents, prime ministers, they just keep up what he calls their theatrics. The wars just keep going, he argues, completely ignoring massive public opposition.
Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is how it explains the why. Let's move to Section 2, the grand chessboard strategy. To figure out how we got from these current symptoms to the root cause, Sachs traces the DNA of today's foreign policy straight back to a 1997 textbook. It was written by former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and it's called The Grand Chessboard. Sachs argues that this book is literally the blueprint for American primacy. The core idea Brzezinski laid out, right after the Soviet Union fell, was that the U.S. absolutely must be the biggest, toughest, unquestioned dominant power in Eurasia. Sachs explains that this strategy treats the globe quite literally like a board game. You know, leaders moving pieces around from Washington, D.C. without taking on any of the actual physical risks themselves.
And to understand how this game is played, we really need to look at this crucial definition from Brzezinski's playbook, the geopolitical pivot state. Just take a second and let this definition sink in. It's kind of a wild concept. Sachs explains that a pivot state is a location the U.S. might not actually care about for its own sake. It has little inherent interest to us. Instead, it's used primarily as a tool, just a pawn on the board, to annoy, weaken, subvert, or divide a major rival power. Basically, they're strategic staging grounds used purely to project American dominance and keep adversaries boxed in.
So applying this to the real world, Sachs actually lists the specific targets right out of Brzezinski's 1997 strategy document. And guess what number 1 on that list is? Ukraine. Sachs argues the whole strategic goal of pushing American power into Ukraine was explicitly meant to strip Russia of its major power status by blocking its access to the Eastern Mediterranean. Next on the list, Iran, which is used to destabilize the region. And then East Asia, places like Korea and Japan, which are used as heavily militarized bases to constantly bother, contain, and weaken China. To Sachs, these aren't just random, unfortunate conflicts, they're literal checklist items from a playbook written decades ago.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because it begs a massive question.
Section 3. The war economy.
If the public is so thoroughly disgusted by endless wars, like Sachs claims, then who on earth is keeping the engine running? Well, Sachs draws a stark contrast here. On one side, you have the stated public motivation, what we hear every night on the news, that these actions are all about preserving American security, democracy, and peace. But on the flip side, Sachs argues the actual motivation is purely about global dominance and massively enriching what he calls the American oligarchs. He insists that practically none of these wars actually involve American security at all, and that they could all be solved pretty quickly through straightforward diplomacy if peace was actually the goal.
And according to Sachs, the people benefiting from this extend way beyond who you might normally suspect. It's not just your classic defense contractors building missiles. Sachs points out that Wall Street heavily relies on the perks of American primacy. Big oil depends on it. And get this, even Silicon Valley is deeply intertwined. He notes that big tech companies are riding a massive financial bubble right now, fueled by selling advanced AI systems and drone warfare tech to the Pentagon for use in places like Ukraine and Gaza. As Sachs puts it, they are all drinking from the trough of the Pentagon.
So, this creates a vicious cycle of corruption. Step 1, the billionaire class and corporate oligarchs pour heavy funding into political campaigns. Step 2, those politicians get into office, sit on armed services committees, and enforce the Pentagon's prerogatives. Sachs uses a really striking example here. He brings up an American senator who publicly complained about a specific defense minister being fired in Ukraine. He asks, wait, why is a U.S. politician intervening in a foreign nation's defense ministry appointments? His answer? Because she's deeply funded by the military-industrial complex. Which brings us to step 3, endless, undeclared wars that just keep going completely without the public's consent.
But, as we all know, a house of cards can only stand for so long. Section 4. Cracks in American primacy.
Sachs argues that this grand, hubristic strategy is currently backfiring in spectacular fashion. Remember Brzezinski's big assumption that America was so technologically and economically dominant, rival nations would just have no choice but to fold and give in to our demands? Well, Sachs points out that this assumption was dead wrong on every single count. Russia didn't fold, they resisted to the point of a devastating war. Iran didn't just magically succumb and change its leadership because of sanctions and military pressure. And China absolutely did not collapse under the weight of containment strategies and trade wars. The strategy of basically bullying the world, Sachs argues, has completely failed to get the compliance they expected.
Which brings us to a really critical breaking point. Sachs highlights what might be the ultimate irony of all of this. The original 1997 playbook explicitly warned that the U.S. must never, ever be stupid enough to allow Russia, Iran, and China to align together. And yet, by aggressively using those pivot states to annoy and weaken all three of them at the same time, aggressive U.S. strategy basically forced those exact three powers into an increasingly tight strategic alliance. According to his analysis, the playbook literally created the very monster it warned us about. All right, bringing it all home for our final point. Section 5, a looming financial crisis.
Because this geopolitical failure isn't just happening on a map thousands of miles away. According to Sachs, the bill is coming due right here at home. Trillions. It is just a staggering number to even try to comprehend. According to Sachs, this represents the sheer amount of money the United States has squandered and is still wasting on unwinnable, undeclared wars. And the really crucial detail here? Nobody is being asked to pay taxes for this. Because the public hates the wars, politicians don't dare raise taxes to fund them, so instead, every single dollar of those trillions is simply slapped right onto the national debt.
Sachs warns that this whole illusion of American global dominance is setting the stage for what he calls the biggest financial bubble in history. It's a phenomenal crisis just quietly building in the background. Debt is stacking upon debt, generation after generation, all to fund a war machine that isn't even achieving its strategic goals. We are living, he says, in a state of complete hubristic delusion.
And you can see this delusion perfectly when you contrast America's economic focus with the global reality. Sachs notes that in the U.S., we're obsessing over wildly overvalued, artificially inflated tech stocks tied to defense spending, all while thumping our chests about our military might. But meanwhile, and Sachs shares this great anecdote from a recent trip he took to Asia, visiting these incredibly advanced Chinese factories, he stresses that the rest of the world is just moving on. They are pouring money into physical infrastructure and drastically improving real-world technologies, all while the U.S. is bogged down fighting these exhausting geopolitical pivot wars. For the everyday citizen, Sachs warns this matters profoundly, because while our tax dollars and debt fund the chessboard, the rest of the world is actually out there building the table.
Which leaves us with one final incredibly provocative question to wrap up Sacks's analysis. How is this massive geopolitical and financial bubble finally going to burst? Even Sacks admits this model is entirely unsustainable. So, does it end in some terrifying, unthinkable catastrophe in a world that is armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons? Or, as Sacks hopes, will normal, everyday decency, public disgust, and an awakened understanding finally overwhelm a corrupted political system and dismantle the war machine? It is a super heavy question, for sure. But understanding the structure of Sacks's argument, seeing the world through his view of the chessboard, well, that's the first step in deciding for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today, and remember to always keep questioning what you see on the board.